This video is going to be about Tableau and AI. Now, I tried to make this video in late 2024, and it was largely because there was something about Tableau's AI efforts that wasn't quite connecting with the way that I was using the product. And I couldn't quite put a finger on it. And I made this video 3 times, and each time I just couldn't come to terms with what I'd made. There was something missing. I just didn't understand what it was though. So I decided to use AI a bit more for a lot longer and think more critically about it and go on a journey of discovery mainly to understand what it was that I didn't like about some AI features over other features. Not just in Tableau, this is across the whole industry. And so in this video, I've pulled all of that into one context to try and create a marker in the sand so we can look at this video as a point in time of how Tableau was doing with AI. Now, the other thing is if you're at Salesforce and you're watching this, you know more than anyone that I'm the biggest fan of the product. But I think this video is a necessary part of continually challenging you to make a better product. And so I'm really open to constructive feedback. A lot of you reach out to me on Slack and give me sort of points in return to what I've said here in the video. Sometimes you even drop comments below. So that's very much your stage here and on LinkedIn to sort of get back to me as well. Okay, the context is set. The barrel's loaded. Let's fire some shots. You know what comes next? Let's get stuck in. You'll see from the timestamps in this video that in order to be able to really kind of have this discussion in a constructive way, we must first look at the industry in general, AI specifically, and narrow in on data and analytics in that industry to really set the standard upon which Salesforce and by extension Tableau can be judged against. And so what I wanted to do is just bring everyone up to speed on what these big trends are. If you already know what happened in 2024, just skip ahead to the next chapter. But I think it's important to touch on this because this is the context upon which I'll be judging Tableau and their capabilities. So 2024 was extremely confusing when it comes to AI because it just felt like throughout the whole year, the marketing teams at some of the largest companies in the world were 2 pages ahead of the engineers who are actually building the features. So you'd often get the marketing well before the feature arrived. And so you had this sort of exchange where companies would promise these really big promises, but then they'd sort of fall short when they actually came to pass. And we were also even meant to get specific models released this year, but they didn't really transpire. But if you were paying attention, there were really a handful of key players that you'll probably know about, you've heard about. The first one is obviously OpenAI and ChatGPT. I'm just looking at my notes here. The big thing that ChatGPT did is they really increased the range and capability of all their models, not just doing the standard models that we've been used to in ChatGPT, but taking that to a future of multimodal access. So being able to work with images, text, and video all in the same model, but then also releasing different models that you could use specifically for creating videos and even reasoning in the most recent example just before Christmas. The other big player was Google with Gemini. Now Gemini is really promising because Google's really pushing forward when it comes to context. They have some of the largest windows for context. By context, we're talking about the amount of information you can provide the AI model in order for it to process your request. So Google are really pushing forward with the context they want to bring to you. And also their latest model, Gemini 3.2, is actually one of the most powerful models, allowing you to live stream capabilities to the model. Andy Cockgrove made a good video recently showing you how you could do this to essentially replace me in terms of Tableau tutorials. So go ahead and check out that video. I'll put a link in the description. The other player that I think a lot of people are sleeping on is Anthropic with Claude. Now, Claude is very similar to ChatGPT, but I actually find it much more capable. In fact, throughout the whole of 2024, I only used Claude for pretty much all my coding tasks, and I typically demoted ChatGPT to frivolous use, just being able to ask a question quickly on an app. ChatGPT is farther ahead because they have the experience dialed in. But when Claude catches up, I'll mostly be using Claude. And you'll find that Claude also have a much better capability of understanding context. And I just found some of the outputs that Claude was putting out just felt more reasonable. They felt more workable, much easier to edit, much more pleasant to read. The last company to mention here is obviously Meta. Their big push is making AI models more open source. Essentially, they have a licensing structure that stops the really large companies from capitalizing on their model, but allows everyone else to run these models on their laptops. I actually have a working version of the latest Llama model in the largest form running on my laptop, which is absolutely wild to think that that's kind of possible without having to send my data to the cloud. I think is incredible. So those were the 4 big players. Now, One player that I haven't mentioned yet is NVIDIA. NVIDIA is notable here because they make all the hardware that many of these companies are using to not only run these models, but also build the models. So if you're paying attention to the AI race in 2024, you'll know that NVIDIA is making the hardware and making the sort of foundational leaps in terms of architecture and infrastructure to allow companies to actually build models at scale. But that said, every other company who makes hardware is very close behind trying to eat into that market. And so with the big companies and players out of the way, it's now really easy to sort of synthesize what the big trends were. And for the record, many people will disagree on this. I've just pulled out what I think were the salient points from the year. But the first one is multimodal design, essentially models that can take in multiple forms of input to process a request. We've already touched on that with ChatGPT, but actually Google are doing the same thing. And I think in the future, all models will have multimodal context. The other one, more subtle but linked to multimodal input, is giving models larger context windows. So this is something that I mentioned Google is good at. That is really important because it allows us to put larger and larger data sets to the point where we can actually start to answer meaningful questions when it comes to business. For example, if I wanted to take an entire PDF and ask an LLM to process it and find specific bits of information, previously, that was pretty hard in 2023. Now the context windows are large enough in most models for you to be able to put large documents, even books, inside of the context window and then ask the model lots of different questions. We'll come back to this in a short while. The other one you will have heard from Salesforce specifically is Agentic AI. Now, Agentic AI seems to be like an outcome of the industry realizing that chat models and LLMs were basically not that useful for business context. What people were really looking for is autonomous solutions. And so they've sort of crystallized around this concept of agentic AI, this idea that there are lots of autonomous agents doing tasks on behalf of users, saving time, increasing productivity, and potentially doing things that are actually quite hard to do in a manual way or in a direct way. So this is something really big. You'll have seen Salesforce talk about Agentforce, their push into this specific field. And we'll come back to that later because obviously we'll dig into Tableau and Salesforce specifically. The next one is edge computing. This is a very simple concept. At the moment, all AI models, you run them in the browser or if you've got Meta locally on your machine. Now, being able to run it locally on your machine is actually quite useful because it saves you having to send data to the cloud. And this is what essentially edge computing is. Essentially, these large companies making their models small enough so they can be fit into a local context. So local context being your data center, your business, and it allows you to run these models locally. So a very simple example, maybe I've got a CCTV camera in front of my home. Instead of hooking it up to the cloud and streaming my video over to Google, instead with edge computing, I can buy a computer, put it in a network in my house, and just have the doorbell camera stream that input right to that specific node. So that's much, much easier. And it's actually quite advantageous in specific instances where you need the sort of data and information to happen really quite fast. The downside with the internet is that it takes time to send information back and forth. Edge computing allows this processing to happen locally and it allows it to happen much faster. The other one was the proliferation of advanced AI architecture, specifically RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation, and the other one is COT, Chain of Thought. Now, with RAG, the most notable example here is Google's Notebook LLM. Now, this is quite an interesting one because what it allows you to do is upload a bunch of documents, and then it can do things like generate a podcast based on those documents. But the idea here is that you're grounding your AI model in the information that you give it, which makes it much, much easier to do things like I could upload a bunch of insurance document and then ask the model a bunch of questions about all of those documents. But then the key thing is that the AI models is able to link to specific context, specific pages, and even highlight information for us, which makes it much easier to pass large sets of information without needing to pass them, which is absolutely brilliant. The other one you'll have seen just before Christmas is Chain of Thought. So this is all about AI models starting to behave like humans, essentially showing their reasoning and processing problems in small chunks, but then showing you they're working as they go along. This is a very advanced use case, but I think this is a very prominent type of AI model that we'll see a lot in 2025. And the last one I've already mentioned, but this is the concept of foundational models, essentially taking any of these models, packaging them up, and then building enhanced capabilities on top of them to do very, very specific things and grounding those concepts so that essentially your model can be trained to do one task very, very well. And so those were the large trends. I could make a documentary about this if I had the time and I knew more about it, but I don't. So I'm going to stop it here. I think if you've got any points that you think I've missed, put them in the comments below. But I think these are the main trends that we want to take forward into our understanding of how Tableau has performed with AI. And we can start to see how Salesforce has adopted these methods. Okay, now that you've covered the trends, you'll obviously start to be making some sort of value judgments about how 2024 went. Some of the things I mentioned didn't go well at all for the AI industry. Some of those things actually caused huge problems in society. And it's obviously going to spawn legislation, and it's going to have us discuss the concept around data privacy and security all over again in the industry. But I think this particular discussion then forces you to have a perspective. And this is the next most important thing when evaluating how Tableau and AI have gone in 2024. And that is, what is your perspective? What guidelines do you have for yourself when using AI? Let me share mine, and maybe that will help you construct your own set of guidelines before we actually get stuck into what Salesforce's guidelines are. Like any perspective, my view on AI is largely personal. It's based on my experience of using AI over the last now year and a half. And I have to say, AI has been a transformational capability in my working life, but also in my personal life. I've used it to do things that I just didn't have sometimes the scale or reach to be able to do. And that doesn't mean that I was using it to automate my work or using it to do things for me. A lot of the time I was actually using it as an assistive tool to sort of aid my brain in thinking. It was very much a bicycle for the mind. And that really frames my perspective, because I view AI as a tool. I view it as something that I should use to empower me, and I view it as something that I should choose to wield at the right time. And so I have a bunch of principles, a bunch of guidelines that help me decide when and how to do that. And so I want to share that with you because I think it's important to have this when you're building a tool that millions of people are going to build. And we'll shortly look at Salesforce's view. I want to show you mine, and this will help frame the critique I'll have for Tableau AI a little later. Now, these are quite simple, so I'll go through them quickly. The first point I want to touch on is purpose. I genuinely think that all AI tools need to have a genuine purpose in our lives. And by purpose, I'm really talking about AI offering something more than what can already be done by an individual. A good example is writing. We will see people using AI to write articles on the internet, and actually a lot of what we're consuming, especially on LinkedIn and on websites, I think is being generated by AI. And you can just tell there's some sort of standard conclusion that these things come to. There's a certain sort of metronomic tempo that people are suddenly starting to hit with content, and you can tell that's being powered by AI. And what that does is it reduces the connection that we have with each other. And in that instance, I think the purpose of AI should be to stay away, and it should be to help us think better, think more clearly, evaluate concepts that we haven't thought of. And that's very much sort of a key thing for me, using AI to empower what I do. And the purpose should be to enhance and go beyond what I was previously capable of while still putting me in the driving seat. And that's sort of a very hard thing to describe, but you'll see how that plays out when we start to look at some of the features inside of Tableau. Now, the next one is ethics. Ethics is pretty straightforward to understand. We're talking about transparency. We're talking about privacy. We're talking about a whole range of concepts that really talk about how we view individuals on this planet, if I sort of make it a larger concept. Now, every society, every culture will have a different set of ethics, and your business will have a different set of ethical boundaries that it will operate under compared to another business. But the point here is that when you look at the companies you're using and you're looking at the tools you're using, I think it's important to evaluate their ethics, because AI is one of those tools that has the ability to take a set of ethics and imprint it on your work. So if I go ahead and take a piece of text and I tell OpenAI or ChatGPT to write it better, when it writes that context, the ethics that it uses to sort of comprise that text, to build that text up, are going to be based on the model and the way that it's built. And the ethics that goes into that are going to touch on things like copyright. You might have a view and opinion about how work is valued in society. That is an ethical concern. You might have a view about how certain communities are represented and how they're represented specifically in literature. That is, again, another ethical thing to be understood. And so when we talk about ethics, it's not easy for me to say, here are a bunch of guidelines to follow. What I really mean here is, how do these AI tools support and enhance your own set of ethics, or do they go against them? Do they use data that's maybe not theirs? Do they scrape information that they maybe should have paid for? And do they maybe put certain communities under harm? That's a really important and hard subject to touch on. I won't go into it in this video, but I think it's an important one, and you know what I mean. Now, the last one is a very general one. I'm going to just call it good karma. And this is a hard one to describe. I'm just looking at my notes here because I'm trying to find a better way to frame it. When I talk about good karma, I think of tools sometimes as citizens in our world. So a good example, when we drive our car day to day, I think when people buy a car, they don't just think about its ability to go from A to Z. They also think about things like fuel economy. They also think about potentially its impact on the environment, because that is a very topical thing. And so when car companies promote their cars, they'll talk about those specific attributes, because when we buy a product, what we are also buying is a perspective in some cases. Sometimes products imbue those principles. So Apple will be, a good example here. They have a range of products that are completely carbon neutral because they have a view, they have a perspective on karma in the world. So their products are designed to try and, leave a positive impact on the planet. Now, whether you buy that or not, that's a separate discussion. But that's sort of what I'm going for here. Do the companies building these models and do these models in general leave a sense of good karma in the communities that they operate in? And that's a hard one to talk about, but I think it's a perspective that I can share with you as we start to look at the rest of the product. Okay, now I think we've talked about enough about my perspective. Let's talk about Salesforce's perspective, because they have some guidelines that they use to develop products. And we're going to start talking a lot more about Tableau. Okay, we're here. We're talking about AI and Salesforce, and by extension, Tableau. But I think it's important to just say one more thing. We often talk about Tableau like it's both a company and a product. And I think this has been a mistake in the community for a long, long time. And we're now in 2025. Tableau used to be both a product and a company. It's no longer that. It's now Salesforce the company and Tableau the product. And the reason that's important is because when we're sort of comprising our critique, I think we now have to channel it towards Salesforce. And in order to do that, we have to understand the context in which Salesforce operates in. And so what I'm going to do here is kind of split those two things apart. I'm going to look at Salesforce, their company, the way they look at AI, and then see how that translates into the Tableau ecosystem after that. So in this first part, let's look at how Salesforce has been talking about AI for the last year and a half, some of the principles they have, and then we can evaluate of how well those have translated to Tableau and the impact they've had on the product. AI in the Salesforce ecosystem, I think, is a real struggle to understand because of the way that Salesforce markets itself. I actually think a lot of the detail is there and it's very easy to find, but it's very easy to also get confused because of some of the way the products are named and some of the way the platform is presented to users. So let me try and sort of synthesize this in the most basic way possible and just give you the things you need to know. The best place to start is with the Einstein 1 platform. Now, the way this works is that the Einstein 1 platform is basically the platform upon which all of Salesforce operates under. And this is a fairly new thing. It was clearly a move to sort of get them ready for AI, hence the term Einstein. You'll come back to that a lot in a minute. But essentially, think of this platform as the foundation, the ground upon which all the different services that Salesforce have operate under. And I'll have something up on screen. You'll see that Slack, Quip, Tableau, Heroku, and then all of the CRM apps operate on. And then based off that, you have these sort of two wings, two flanks, as it were. You've got the data cloud where your data resides. Then you've got Einstein on the right-hand side. And in between those, you have bridges, let's call them. So on the left, we have real-time data, this concept of being able to access your data in situ. And then on the right, you have something called the Einstein Trust Layer, kind of bridge between your CRM apps and Einstein. And so the best way to think of this is to think of this as the following. Einstein 1 is the platform upon which everything operates under. Einstein is actually the brand that is used for all AI capabilities. The Einstein Trust Layer is what allows your data to live in that world, essentially creating some sort of separation between your data that should stay private and personal and all these AI models that are being run by large operators like OpenAI. Essentially, the Einstein Trust Layer is the bridge upon which that works. If we actually switch over to the screen here, there's actually a really good fact sheet that they have that kind of goes into this and kind of digs into a lot more detail. And I'm just sort of scrolling through it now. You'll be seeing it on screen. And as we start to sort of go down the feature list, you'll see that Einstein is essentially tagged onto pretty much everything. And this should show you that anything with Einstein is essentially an AI capability. But the other thing to note here is that actually in 2023, AI had this, I think, transformational change, which meant that it basically became the headline name, the headline title for all the disciplines that previously sort of sat in a much broader set of context. So, for example, features that were previously termed machine learning are now called AI features. Predictive analytics, some of those capabilities are now starting to be termed under the AI banner. And so the other thing to remember is that AI will also incorporate a lot of features and capabilities that were previously there before, but came before this AI hype train. And so AI has become the big banner, and it's both a discipline within that field as well as the banner title, if that makes sense. So that's sort of my way of explaining this. The one thing to note here on this page, though, is that there's no mention of Tableau. And this is just 2 clicks off the home page. If you search Salesforce AI, you go to a page about Einstein, you go click on the fact sheet, and there is no mention of Tableau, and we're in 2025. I think that's a little bit awkward. There's still a mention of CRM analytics, obviously the existing analytic capability inside of the Salesforce ecosystem, but I think it's just strange that there is no mention of Tableau in this fact sheet whatsoever. Maybe they've forgotten to update it, but I think details like this really start to matter when we're talking about Salesforce AI principle carrying through to Tableau. How can that even work if it's not represented here at the high level? Okay, the next thing to understand are the guiding principles that Salesforce uses to build products, because they actually have these, and I actually think these are really, really good. They're really hard to find though, so what I want to do is sort of surface them to you and show you what they are. So Salesforce have this concept called Guidelines for Responsible Development. There's a blog post which you'll see on screen right now. And in that blog post back from February 2023, they outline these sort of core principles, and I'll put them up on screen. Essentially, they talk about accuracy, safety, honesty, empowerment, and sustainability. In a funny way, these align very much with some of my own personal perspectives that I thought about earlier. It's obviously termed slightly differently and different things go into the different headers, but it's very clear that they've put a lot of thought into it. I'm not going to read them out now. I'll leave a link to these in the description so you can go check them out. But what I found interesting is if you dig into these, there's actually a lot more behind it. There's a lot more thought that's gone in there. And there's another sort of set of information that you can find here when you search trusted AI in the Salesforce ecosystem. And it talks about their commitment, those same values, and how they work around this concept of trust, which I think makes a ton of sense. And then there's also a ton of transparency about the way their models are built and some of the ways their models are trained, the issues and challenges. If you go into some of these model cards, there's some really detailed information about how their models could do better, how they could be improved, tied into research that's being done in the community about those specific things. So if you really care about sort of this foundation and understanding in terms of ethics, but also understanding how you make sure that your customers aren't abusing these principles in order to do things in their companies that could potentially harm people. They have something called the AI acceptable use policy. And in that policy, it actually restricts customers from using their services from misusing AI, which I think is actually really, really good. Again, it's hard to find, but it's there, and it shows there's actually a lot of thought has gone into it. And so this makes me feel sort of fuzzy and warm inside, because on one hand, I actually think, yeah, you know, I had a bunch of views and perspectives and thoughts about how AI should be used. And it turns out that at least Salesforce does have this thought. It has it documented. It has it easy to share. Not easy to find. I think they could do a lot of better, but Salesforce has that information. Now, the challenge starts to come when you start to think, well, how does this translate to Tableau? And how do the features specifically start to resonate with some of the other principles we talked about earlier in the video? It's now time to talk about Tableau and AI. Let's get into it. So when it comes to Tableau and AI, it's an interesting story because actually quite a lot of features have existed for some time before AI was a bit of a hype train. And so if we think about explained data and ask data, these would be features that today come under the AI banner, but have actually existed before the hype. And so you can kind of see these as part of that journey that Tableau had already started and already been on. They use capabilities such as machine learning and statistical methods in order to help analysts, but fundamentally they fall under this larger banner. And then came features like Tableau Pulse. Now, Tableau Pulse is sort of interesting because it's largely grounded in statistical methods in order to give you the insight that it generates, but it uses generative AI to summarize those insights. So the actual AI bit here isn't the analysis, it's the summarization, the ability to send you that email and give you a hint of what's going on across the landscape of metrics that you follow. So Tableau Pulse was really the first ground up capability that was built from scratch in this new area. And then following that, we have the Tableau agent. Now, the Tableau agent is interesting because it's a feature, but it's spread across multiple products. You'll have it inside of Tableau Prep web authoring experience, and you'll also have it in the Tableau authoring experience, again in the web. So these features only run in the web. And I actually did a survey of users, and I asked everyone on LinkedIn, hey, look, when you build something, whether it's in Tableau Prep or in Tableau in general, do you start in the desktop or do you start in the web? And actually the responses came back predominantly for desktop. And this sort of starts to point at some of the challenges I see. A lot of this new world is designed for the web first. And I think that's largely because of a challenge around legacy in the product. You see, AI is a fairly new thing, and in order to incorporate it, you'll see that Tableau Pulse was a net new build. You even see that when you go to the Tableau Pulse experience. It has a very different vibe. It definitely is a sort of new look Tableau compared to the traditional legacy Tableau that we've seen. And that was actually one of the first features to involve AI. We've then had Tableau Agent, which took a lot longer to implement into the platform, but you see they've only done it in the web. And so this is the biggest hint. All of the AI capabilities have only really come through in the web interface. Now, this is both a good thing because it shows that Tableau is able to push these features through much faster in the web authoring experience compared to the sort of legacy desktop setup. But it also does start to sort of pose some questions, which I'll come back to later on, about things that I think are missing in Tableau's journey involving AI. But anyway, let's stick to the sort of existing points that we're on here. Now, the other thing about the Tableau agent is that it has different capabilities in different products. So in Tableau Prep and in Tableau Web Authoring, you can get it to help you with calculations. And this is great because it actually helps people who are trying to write calculations or know what they need to write, but just want to save a bit of time, and you can go in and use it. In the web authoring experience, especially for authoring, you also get this other ability to allow you to build charts. You can ask it to do some analysis for you, and it will go ahead and use the interface and build it for you. This is a great way to learn. It's a great way to understand it. But again, it's only available through web authoring. And so what we're starting to have is a body of features that are starting to sort of pop up in disparate places. But the big challenge, as you can tell, is that there's no one cohesive experience. You know, Tableau Agent is very much limited to the side pane. It's sort of very much off to the side. And what is evident from all of this is that actually the biggest challenge Tableau have is getting AI into what feels like a modern interface. And the current sort of legacy setup that we have is no longer suitable for this. Now, there is another argument you could make here. Earlier on, when I talked about some of the trends in 2024, it was very obvious that one of the big transformational sort of steps in 2024 was the ability to run models locally. This idea that you don't need the cloud to run the model. You can actually get these models scaled down to fit on your laptop, or even be able to run them on the edge. And so what is interesting is that while Tableau is pushing forward with this sort of cloud-first mentality, there is an emerging move in the industry to do the opposite. And so we haven't heard much of this narrative. And actually what's interesting is that we've not even seen Tableau deliver or Salesforce deliver on their promises to allow us to use different models inside of the AI product. Way back when we first saw this sort of first instantiation of the Tableau agent in the Salesforce ecosystem, there was talk about allowing us to use different models to do different things. And in today's world, that would just be like using ChatGPT for one task, using Claude for a separate task, and then using Google Gemini for something else. Essentially being able to choose your foundational model inside of the Tableau ecosystem for various reasons, and then being able to build on those to perform various tasks. Now that hasn't transpired. It's also not very clear what version of ChatGPT that Tableau are using behind the scenes, because as I understand it, everything is currently working with OpenAI, but just from my day-to-day use, it's very obvious it's not the latest and greatest version of OpenAI that I have on my laptop and that you can use on the web service. It feels like an older version. So the transparency there is sort of lacking. And then the ability to sort of have those options to switch out the modality, as it were, between models is actually something that the industry decided in 2024 was a good thing to do. A lot of tools allow you to switch between different models right in the same interface in a very simple way. We've not seen any of this inside of the Tableau ecosystem. And then on top of that, if you're on Tableau server, you're not getting any of this AI benefit. And so the big challenge here is, while the industry is talking about having edge AI and having models run locally, I don't understand why there couldn't be a discussion about being able to run models locally on Tableau server. Yes, you might have to tell Tableau server admins to really beef up their servers, but in a world where I can run Llama 38, I think it's 48B 3.2 on my laptop, I don't see why a company couldn't decide to say, well, actually, this technology is useful. We want to run it locally on our Tableau server to do the kind of summarizations that are happening here on this platform. Tell us the specs of the server we need, and we'll make sure we set up our servers for that. Some companies are doing that. A lot more companies are, going back off the cloud onto on-premise infrastructure, and I think it's a trend that will carry on through. And we're not seeing any of that discussion at all inside of the Tableau ecosystem. So that to me is also a red herring, given that it was such a big trend in 2024. So everything I've touched on so far is architectural. It's all about the high level design of the entire Tableau ecosystem. And it's actually quite a poignant time to talk about that because, as you know, Tableau have been marketing the next generation of their platform. Now, one of the things that drives me nuts is that the marketing talks like this product has already been launched. If I go onto the Tableau feed, I'll see a post pretty much once or twice a week showing us this sort of a new thing that's coming. And the problem is we started talking about this new thing that was coming back in April, and we're now in January of 2025 and we don't have access to it. And so it's very hard to talk about this because no one really knows. But what must be clear here is that as this new vision for Tableau comes about, it's clearly going to be the platform upon which AI is a really prominent capability. We're seeing capabilities inside of what I would now call the legacy products today coming through as they were. I would also argue that actually, unbeknownst to, I think, the community in general, I think the number of features and the pace of features coming through is much higher. I'll put some slides up to show you some of the features that are coming through from the community and just the sheer number of features over time that are coming through in the most recent releases. And I think that's an important thing to call out, but those features are not necessarily in the places that necessarily the whole community wants. And so as we go forward into this new Tableau with Agentforce or Tableau Einstein, whatever they decide to call it, as we go into this new world, I think that platform is likely to be the place where AI is a prominent capability, which will then, I think, make some of these older platforms, these older setups of Tableau a little bit sort of lackluster, especially if people are wanting that AI capability. So that's an important thing to talk about from a high level. Now, if I go back to my general principles that I had, I think it was purpose, looking at my notes, empowerment, ethics, and good karma. We look at purpose. I think the Tableau agent is one of those things that I really, really struggle to understand. You see, on one hand, I actually really like the term copilot, and this is not necessarily something I'm attached to, but I think it was a meaningful descriptor of what was happening inside of the product experience. You're writing or you're building something and you want some support. There's a copilot that allows you to go and get that task done. Now, when we talk about agents in the Tableau ecosystem, especially when we talk about agentic AI and the meaning of agentic AI, which is very much an autonomous system doing things on your behalf, I struggle to translate that to the Tableau ecosystem. And this is one of those places where I wish Tableau as a team or Tableau as a product team inside of Salesforce could have just stood up a little bit to the Salesforce messaging and said, actually, we haven't fully delivered on the basic AI experience just yet. We're a way off from agentic AI. Let's just stick with Copilot for a little bit longer. Let's actually deliver on some of that Copilot excellence. If you use Tableau Agent today, it was previously called Einstein Copilot. I don't think that vision has been fully delivered. And so I think it was a necessary thing to finish that vision first before then trying to switch up the game and then focus on agentic AI. Because the thing is, the marketing about agentic AI talks about autonomous systems going off and doing things behind the scenes. Now, that makes sense in the Tableau Agentforce, Tableau Einstein world, but in today's world, every single day as we're working in there, in that side panel, when I go in there, that to me is not an agent. That's still very much a copilot. And it makes that experience a little bit painful because it makes it sort of much further from the reality that we're heading to, if that makes sense. And I'm sure there's lots of work going into making that feature much, much better in 2025. But as of where we left it in 2024, in the term Tableau agent with agentic AI, I think that is really, really far from the vision that's being delivered. Now, the other thing is that when you look at that agent, in some cases it does really well. And this is the thing I've been struggling to sort of battle with in my mind. When we look at Tableau Prep, I think it does a great job because you're in there writing a calculation, you need some help, boom, it can go off and help you think about that calculation. And even if it doesn't get it right, it's okay because the context is so small. You're just writing a calculation and you can see the output, you can see what's going on, you can see the way that's all done. However, when you're inside of web authoring and you start to ask it for help, I just get it misfiring a lot more, and even basic things like understanding the capability that's available in the product, even using the pre-canned responses they try and get you to use as part of a tutorial, it's just not firing on all cylinders. And so there is something sort of disparate about those two. And I think it really boils down to this point around empowerment. I think AI, when you use it, when you get it to do something on your behalf and you arrive at the answer without seeing all the steps that took you there, it kind of has this sort of visceral disconnect with the outcome. It's a bit like IKEA. When you buy IKEA furniture, part of the value in IKEA furniture isn't actually in the price, isn't actually in the quality. It's in the very fact that you build the furniture yourself. So once you've built the furniture, the sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, and it's because you were part of that. Now, IKEA could very easily sell you complete furniture and just ship it to your address. That would be easier than owning a store. It'd be a lot cheaper and they could just ship it directly from where they get to. But here's the thing, that's not part of the experience. That's not the point. The point is the very connection you have with making the product. That is the whole IKEA brand. And so it's sort of an interesting thing when we start to talk about AI here, where we have this agentic AI, which I think is going to start to fragment the connection that people have with data, which is sort of counter to the point. If you look at Tableau, Tableau is very much an ecosystem that it prides itself on people crafting beautiful stories. If you look at the IronViz, which has just had some feeder announcements recently, if we look at Tableau Public, those are all big marketing pushes to really tell the story that, look, Tableau is about crafting stories around data. That is very much sort of the underlying principle behind those platforms. And then here with Agentic AI, we're kind of doing the opposite. We're kind of creating a disconnect between that narrative and how you get there. And if you get there without understanding how anything is done, how can you tell the story in a good way? And so that's where I really struggle. In Tableau Prep, I love it. In web authoring, I don't, because I think it creates this disconnect. Whereas in Tableau Prep, because it's only doing sort of small chunks of work, I think it's a little bit better. So that's sort of a small point about purpose there. And the other thing is, if you're using these agents, I think they can create a new problem. And this problem doesn't exactly help the situation, which is the need to check and verify what's being done, especially with around new analysts. If they're using this capability and they're using it, I think it does increase the burden on me as someone who's trying to educate them to have to check more of their work. Whereas I think if I set off an analyst and say, look, let's give you this path that you can follow. It doesn't involve AI, but I know that as you go through those steps, you're going to learn a couple of core principles, and I'll see that play out in your work. So you won't be trying things that are advanced well before you're ready to do them. The problem with AI is that you can go in there and on day one, you can ask a question that you don't know is an advanced concept, but it will do the question for you and build it and give you an answer. But you don't have the skills to really validate and check that that answer is correct. And so that's sort of a new problem we have. I don't think there's a perfect answer to this. I'm not saying we should avoid using AI for this specific reason, but I think it's a new problem, and that new problem doesn't necessarily help the already big burden we have on being able to validate and check data sources that have taken time to build lots and lots of trust with end users. It takes one wrong answer for someone to lose trust in a data set. It takes years of work as a data team to build that trust with your consumers. And my worry is with AI, there's a good chance that sometimes that will break. So a big thing I'd love to see is a bigger focus on empowerment. Help me get to the answer faster. Help me build those advanced solutions faster. But when I ask a question, instead of just doing it for me, maybe teach me how to get to the answer. Step me through, a bit like you would in ChatGPT. Step me through the steps so that I understand all the key concepts. And that's why I think it's really interesting. Andy did a video about how Google LLM is able to guide you through how to do something in a video. I'll also make a video about this later next week, but nonetheless, I think this is really powerful because it's actually the learning element that I think is really, really valuable with AI, rather than the ability for it to be autonomous and do things behind the scenes. Anyway, I think I've murdered this point. The next point is around ethics. Now, I think the ethics are good here. Salesforce's ethics around how they use AI are pretty good. The one thing I would like to sort of circle back on is that there's this issue around copyright and the approach that these large models have made to go and get data that I think is worth exploring. Now, Salesforce is kind of immune to this a little bit because they didn't go and do this and build their own model. Maybe they're doing that behind the scenes. But the large companies, all of them that have built models, even Apple, and a company that I hold to very, very high standards, have done this. They've essentially gone and scraped a ton of information from the internet before then asking for permission to actually use that data. And so when we have that kind of capability in our product, I think there is an ethics question around Salesforce as a company, making sure that it supports the sources that have created some of this original work through its other initiatives. And I think that's something that's really hard to sort of pin down, like where's the right place to talk about that. It's probably in the largest Salesforce organization, but I think it's still important because we're out here using this AI inside of our products. But nonetheless, I think it's important to value how that information and how that AI model was created in the first place. Okay, so it's a couple of days later. Yes, I've put the same shirt back on so I don't disrupt the flow of the video. But I realized I didn't talk about pricing, and pricing is actually really, really important. The reason it's important is because I think there is a point around marketing that comes back to pricing, that comes back to the way we use the product. So bear with me as I try and sort of tell the story, but I think it will make sense by the time I get to the end of it. So just give me a couple of minutes here. So the first thing to realize is I mentioned a survey I did on LinkedIn, and what is pretty clear, and I think is still fairly true, is that most users are still bound to the desktop product. Most users who are creating assets are still bound to desktop product. So when we talk about AI specifically, and we talk about the features that Tableau have brought, those are all based in web authoring. Now, that's not to say that they're not valuable, but when you put that capability into web authoring, what you have to ask is, well, what are people doing in web authoring today that makes sense? And if you look at that survey, I'll post a link to it again, you'll see that most people are going there to sort of complete work, maybe make a couple of changes, but it's very rare that people are genuinely starting new experiences in that part of the product. And so if I just bring up the Tableau pricing page, and I look at this pricing schedule, I'll do a separate video on this because this changed last year and I kind of missed the plot on this, but there's essentially three prices. There's the Tableau, there's the Enterprise, and Tableau Plus. Now, Tableau is probably for no one. Like Tableau is probably just there as an entry product. But Enterprise is really what they want you to have. It's that sort of marketing trick where you have three options and really the one in the middle is actually the one that you shouldn't go for, and the one at the top is the one they want you to get. But nevertheless, AI is only available in the Tableau Plus option. Now, when you click on the Tableau Plus option, it sends you to another page where you have to send in some details. So if I go back to my values that I mentioned earlier, in terms of transparency, it's actually not clear what price you pay to have the AI capability. It's interesting that all the other functionality is very clear up front. You can play around with these two options and see a clear difference in price. What that suggests is that the price for AI is probably something more fluid and is maybe on a customer to customer basis, predicated on things like your size and your clients, but there is no sort of standard set price that's available there. Another thing I always find interesting, look, there's a big fat 20% discount, which kind of tells you where their margins sit in terms of where they're pricing the product. But nevertheless, I'm not a pricing expert, I'm not a pricing analyst, so I'm not going to sit here and say whether this is a good price or not. But this is the most important thing. When you then go back to the AI capabilities and go back to the earlier point I made around curation, it's very clear that Tableau is a marketing function. The marketing functions in Salesforce, when they market Tableau, they market what I would like to think of someone called an artisan. Now, I'm actually borrowing phrases from Alteryx. This is a tool that's not doing too well at the moment, in my honest opinion, but nonetheless, an artisan is someone who is essentially someone who is crafting something beautiful, making something that lots of people are going to use and enjoy. But when you actually look at the capability that they sell, if you look at who they talk to, if you look at the audiences that they are selling to, if you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant, if you look at all of that, the conversation there is actually about the curator, the person who's building these governed data sets, who's managing the security, who's enabling other people to do things. So when Tableau is selling the product, they talk about curators, and when they are marketing the product, they talk about artisans, right? So this is sort of the two visions that you tend to sort of see, and where this sort of causes an issue is there's a sort of an unspoken role for your curator in that discussion. Now, the curator is something that hasn't really existed much in the Tableau ecosystem. I wouldn't say creator roles are curators. A curator is very different to a creator. A creator is someone who builds something, deploys them, and gets them out. A curator is someone who then views all of that content from a perspective of understanding how it's made and decides what is good, what goes where. And in the Tableau ecosystem, there's no role that recognizes that. It's not the server admin. That's a role that's purely designed to sort of get the structure and get it all working. Essentially, think of a server admin as a mechanic on the platform, making sure it's working well, security is done well. A curator is something very specific. And actually, in the new vision for Tableau, the curator is actually one of the most important roles. That's going to be the person who, puts together semantic models, that puts together workspaces, that, curates and guides people and makes sure that the things they need in their day-to-day work is actually available where it should be. And they'll be probably delegating work to creators in this sort of new vision that we're talking about. And so it makes me ask this question, and I'm getting to my point, just please bear with me. I'm getting to my point. So it makes me ask this question: who's the customer and who's the user? Because when you think about the pricing, I think the pricing talks to the customer being the executives, the customer being the people who actually pay for Tableau, the people who are at the end of the invoices, who are looking at the purchase orders for Tableau. But the user is not the same person. And so a lot of the AI, in my opinion, I think targets the customer, the person who's actually paying the invoices, and is maybe pitched towards a world where the curator is a more prominent role. But in today's world, in the products that we use, there is no such thing. It doesn't yet exist. There's no capability that's designed around it. It's very much something that's coming in the future. And so we end up in this, I think, difficult place where I think the pricing reflects the future of where Tableau is heading. Hence, you've got these sort of demarcated Tableau Enterprise and Tableau Plus. It very much tees up a role for curators in the future, but we're not quite there yet. And so the pricing, it makes sense. Again, I'm not a pricing analyst, so I can't tell you whether this is good or not. I've never used other tools and seen the invoices, so I can't tell you whether these are cheap or good or whatever. I know that's the obvious thing to sort of decide, and you can maybe post in the comments if you've paid for one of these and you think they're great value. The people I've spoken to who have access to Tableau Plus do think it's great value for lots of different reasons, okay? So I'm not here to say that. What I am here to say, though, is that the pricing is an important part of this narrative. Just yesterday, a couple of the large AI companies, Microsoft, Google, they've all done something fairly bold, which is they've said to all their existing customers, look, I know you didn't ask for AI, but we're changing our pricing model. We're going to add a few more dollars onto your price for you because we think AI is now part of everyone's work, even though you didn't ask for it. And the price is going up for you. And then they've gotten rid of their top tier, their AI tier. I'm wondering if this pricing setup on Tableau website is actually the middle step towards that. So when Tableau Einstein comes along, you'll have no need for the Tableau base model here. And essentially you'll just have the Enterprise and the Tableau Plus, and then Tableau Plus might have levels that have AI all the way through this. So Enterprise will actually get the Tableau Plus capabilities, and then Tableau Plus will maybe be something more advanced, or maybe it will just disappear. But it definitely feels like that's where a lot of companies are going to head in the future. Microsoft have just done it. Google have just done it. I'll try and put links to that in the post. So it's an evolving topic. I can't sit here and give you an opinion whether the pricing is good or not. Again, I've told you why, but it's definitely strange because I think the pricing speaks to one type of person in the ecosystem, but the marketing of the product speaks to a completely different person, and that person isn't reflected here in the pricing. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Back to the video. The very last point is about good karma. Now, I think the good karma point is actually quite easy to cover here inside of Tableau because I genuinely think that, again, Salesforce and the product managers are putting a ton of great thought into the product to make sure that it really delivers on all the promises that everyone has. Now, this is going to be something that will evolve over time. So it's not easy to just say, look, here's where we are in 2024. I think it was good or bad. I think it's easy to actually find an issue maybe next week that makes us reflect on 2024 and think that actually 2024 wasn't good. So this is a moving target. But I think based on what I showed you earlier on from Salesforce's ethics and how they're going about principles of developing these features, and then what we're seeing about the future of Tableau, there's a lot of transparency here, there's a lot of detail. And I think the best way to really frame this discussion is actually to become part of the community. And so this leads me to my very final point for this video. Come and get involved in a community panel that's happening in a couple of weeks. I'll be moderating along with a bunch of other hosts. I'll put them up on screen here. I can't go through all of them right now, but there's going to be a great discussion about this topic. And I think we'll cover some of the topics that we've discussed in this video, but we'll also cover some of the new concepts that I think everyone in the community is thinking about. So go ahead, get involved, and I'll catch you in the next one.